Guys, welcome back. This is Ping. Wow, it's been almost a year when I started in June 2020. And yeah, time really flies, even during the pandemic. Today's episode is very special. It's dedicated to those people who are interested in knowing third culture kids. Tanya is a consultant in that, and we first talk about what third culture kids are and what are the differences between cross-cultural kids and TCKs. Also, what are the advantages or strength or even the weaknesses of being TCKs and what we need to understand about TCKs. She interviewed around 750 adult TCKs, so then she kind of had those findings and she was very generous to share with us and through experience and stories. Also, at the end of the episode, she talked about how parents and family and the community can support TCKs because usually TCKs are in their own little corners and a lot of people don't really understand their experience. So she has a book called Misunderstood as well. So feel free to check it out. Her work is just phenomenal. So I hope that everyone who has that cross-cultural intersection should be listening to this episode. And also, I would like to hear your feedback. And if you have questions for Tanya, I am more than glad to collect those questions and then maybe do another episode, or I can share those questions to her. You can also connect with her personally. And you can see the episode notes for all the contact info. So yeah, let's get started. Welcome to Chai with Ping. This is Ping Robert. In this podcast, I cover underrepresented and personal stories. Join me with a cup of chai and take a listen. Cool. Before we start, any questions?
Nope, sounds good.
No. All right, let's get started. Welcome back to Chai with Ping. My name is Ping Robert. Thank you so much for listening and tuning in, coming back to the show. My show covers immigrant stories and minority issues. And if you like my show, please share with other people and then give some review on Apple Podcasts. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram. And yeah, so that's all done of my slogan in the beginning of the show. Today, we have a special guest. She is so cool. I met her at a conference online. I was not expecting how wonderful and marvelous that she would talk about the topics that she's so focused on. So then I just decided to research on her. I didn't have her email or whatever. I just searched online. I asked her around like what her name is and all that. And so she is a cross-cultural consultant and she focuses on TCK and CCK and she's an advocate for them. And she's also an author of the book, Misunderstood, The Impact of Growing Up Overseas in the 21st Century. It's a mouthful. I'm going to say it again. Misunderstood, The Impact of Growing Up Overseas in the 21st Century. Let's welcome Tanya Crossman.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yay! Finally!
To be here. Yeah,
I know.
Make this work.
Yes, I saw your talk in January this year, and this now is April. So thank you so much for coming to the show.
Yeah, I'm really glad to get to be here and to talk about my favorite topic.
Definitely. So because listeners have no background, no background knowledge about you. So why don't you start with a little bit your self-introduction and where you're coming from?
Sure. So I'm Tanya. I have grown up mostly in Australia, but also lived in the US in high school for a few years because of my dad's job. My family moved over there. When I was 21, I moved to Beijing. I was supposed to be studying there at university for a year, then go back to Australia and be a normal Australian. But that didn't happen. I stayed instead. I ended up the first time in China for 10 and a half years. I interned at a publishing company. I got a job at an international church. And then I met a youth group of TCKs, third culture kids. Not that I knew the term at the time. And very soon realized that this is what I wanted to do, was to work with these kids. Not knowing that I shared some of that experience myself. And so for the next, 8 years, I stayed in China taking different jobs so that I could continue doing that work and eventually switch to doing that full time which led to running talks, creating resources, and then researching and writing my book, which was all about that perspective of living overseas. I did a lot of work in Cambodia as well. I'm really focused on cross-sector work, so getting people from different groups together and sharing resources, creating resources, and especially encouraging and supporting parents and other carers and educators who are working with these cross-cultural populations to support them and to help them grow and develop emotional maturity and social emotional skills and just, have a stronger foundation for a healthier, holistic life.
I read your bio. I'm just curious about like how the Asian studies in Mandarin Chinese fit into your picture. Like, but because you finished your school in Australia, right?
Well, actually, my Asian studies degree had a program where it was kind of like an honours year, like you did a year of study in a country that spoke the language that you majored in. So my first year in China was also the last year of my degree from my Australian university. That's why I went to China, was it was part of that program. So I had like a travel grant and insurance from my university in Australia and connections to help me do that. So that's why I went in the first place. I stayed because I was in this international community with people from all over the world and seeing different ways of living, different ways of approaching life, and recognize that there was something else out there and that maybe I could live differently. And I didn't know what that was. I didn't know what I wanted. But there was just this sense that if I stayed, I could expand my horizons and learn a bit more. And I thought, well, I'm 22. I can afford to like waste a few years, I guess. If this doesn't work out, it's not the end of the world. And what is it? Nearly 20 years later. And I'm very, very glad I made that decision. So I've spent most of my adult life in China now.
Wow. Was it a place?
Australia, but.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, we will talk about that a little bit later at the end, like where you are. And was Beijing also the place that you met your husband, if I may ask?
Yeah. I actually met him pretty early on, about 18 months after I moved to China. It just took us about 13 years to actually get around to getting married. So.
Wow. Okay.
We were a bit too young when we met, so we were just best friends for years.
Nice. The listeners might not know, Tanya's husband is American. So you also have a cross-cultural relationship than marriage. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty unique. I mean, because you also work as a cross-cultural consultant, I think that piece also play, I don't know how much impact that has to your career.
Yeah, it definitely does. I mean, and his family's also cross-cultural. His dad's American, his mom's Filipino. Okay. And he grew up in China. So a big piece for me is having to take that professional hat off when I'm at home in my marriage, right? Like I can't be sitting there analysing my husband. Occasionally I slip and he notices. Because my focus has to be when I'm at home with him, I'm not there to analyse him or there to fix him. I'm there to be his wife. I'm there to support him and to be in relationship with him. And so I'm not there to teach him or train him or, even if there are insights that I have from my professional life, like that's not the place for it. It can be tricky sometimes. There's content of my work that we don't talk about because it hits him in a different way. And that's fine. That's okay. He's also very supportive of my work, even when there's aspects he doesn't understand or doesn't get. He's really... he's a big supporter. He really helps me with the technical stuff as well. It's been really helpful.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. When I was viewing your website, it's just like, wow, there's a lot of resources and someone must be putting so much heart and efforts on it. And we're just gonna diving in the topic today. So listeners, I already interviewed several TCK third culture kids on my channel. So if you feel free to, interested, then you can feel free to click those ones and I will link the names and the episodes in the episode notes. So then, Tanya, what is TCK for you?
So a TCK, it's a third culture kid, is anyone who spends at least a few years of their childhood, a significant time, living outside their passport country, but expecting to return. So That sounds a bit clunky, I realize, but it's important because the classic experience of a third culture kid is someone who is growing up in a country they're not legally connected to. So they're developing emotional connections with a country they don't legally belong to. One of the easiest way to understand this, though, is to understand what those three cultures are. So first culture is legal cultures. So that's where the government recognizes you as belonging. So you have citizenship, you have a passport, or you have permanent residency. So it's any place that you can walk in anytime and you're recognized as having rights there. You don't need a visa that you have to renew. You can go there anytime. 35% of TCKs have more than one legal culture. That statistic came from my research, and it's held in every international school classroom I've gone into around the world. Around about a third of them have more than one. Second culture is geographic cultures. That's any culture that you have direct personal experience with. So it's mostly countries you've lived in. I also include heritage cultures there, where it's a country that you've never lived in and you've never had legal recognition in, but your parent is from that culture, like they've immigrated, and so you have this direct connection and influence from it. So, for example, a kid I interviewed whose parents had immigrated from Korea to Canada, and she had lived in a bunch of different places, but never in Canada, never in Korea. So she had never had Korean citizenship, had never lived in Korea, but that Korean culture and heritage was very important to her. I would count that as one of her geographic cultures. 40% of TCKs have 4 or more geographic cultures. 10% have 6 or more. So when we're talking about the third culture, we're not talking about a number of countries. We're talking about types of cultures. And the third culture itself is this culture of shared experiences, a relational culture, people who've been through what I've been through. And the third culture kid experience is largely the culture of your first and seconds, not overlapping. So of having countries that you live in and have direct experience of and have built these emotional connections to and don't have legal status in. And conversely, having a country or countries that you have a legal status in that you don't have those comprehensive emotional connections to. That's the really key third culture kid experience.
I have a question though. I mean, you talk about legal status. So I am a dual citizen of Taiwan and the US. I was born here and then grew up in Taiwan, but I don't think I'm TCK. Am I?
You would be a cross-cultural kid. So a TCK is a subset of CCK, cross-cultural kid.
Okay.
A cross-cultural kid is anyone who has meaningful interaction with more than one culture before age 18. And there are so many ways that you can have that interaction. One is having dual citizenship or having and living in both of those cultures, but no other cultures. Or having parents from 2 different cultures, having parents from 2 different ethnicities, even if it's the same passport country, being from a minority culture within a majority culture, being from an immigrant family, a refugee family, being asylum seekers, living in a borderlander community. So, for example, Kashmiris or Kurds, where their people group spans more than one national border. Being an international adoptee as well is an example of this. Another group I work with a lot are what we call educational cross-cultural kids. And these are children who live in their passport country but attend international schools. So they're being educated in a language and culture that's different from their passport country and culture. So there's all these different cross-cultural experiences, and third culture kids are just one of those. So I work with lots of different kinds of cross-cultural kids, and I think it's really important to be aware of that bigger umbrella because generally speaking, when we have these cross-cultural experiences, we have resonance with each other. We even if we don't technically fit a TCK description, but we resonate with these experiences in the literature because we've got very similar emotional experiences. So I'm not really hung up on whether you fit the definition or not if you benefit from the resources. Same as if you do fit the technical TCK description, but you don't really identify with it, then that's fine too. I'm all about labels and definitions are helpful if it helps you understand yourself and your experiences and find community. If you feel that it's instead telling you have to be this way, then that's no use to that. So
So
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah. Because I was like thinking when you're talking, I'm like, okay, should I retitle all those episodes? Because all those people were immigrant kids. Well, one of them, they grew up. So Eber grew up in China, being Americans. But the other ones, like they're Asians, growing up in the US with immigrant parents. So they're CCKs.
Yeah, I get a lot of immigrant kids who read my book and identify really strongly with it and find it really helpful.
Yeah.
I've even had friends of mine who read it and who are immigrant kids and are like, oh my gosh, I'm a TCK and this is so helpful. And I'm not going to correct that. Like, if you identify with this and it's helpful to you, then that's fantastic. The technical definitions are helpful, and I think the distinctions matter. But it doesn't matter as much as you finding the help that you need.
Got it.
In my opinion.
Yeah.
And I think there's a real strong reason that TCKs and immigrant kids in particular find resonance with each other. And that's because you have an experience that is basically the same but opposite. In both cases, you end up stuck between the country and culture you're living in and the country and culture that your parents are from. The difference or distinction between the immigrant kid and the TCK is that in the immigrant kid's experience, the country they are living in is their legal culture and the culture of their parents is not. In the TCK's case, the country they're living in is not their legal culture, the country of their parents is. And so there's some different expectations on where you're supposed to settle long term. There's some different expectations on or different opportunities, perhaps. So, for example, kids who grow up in countries like China or Saudi Arabia who literally don't have the option to settle in the country that they're emotionally connected to because there is no immigration pathway. They can't stay there. They have to leave. They can only be there as long as their parents are working there. That's a very specific experience to the TCK. On the other hand, the immigrant kid is seen differently within that majority culture, right? So there's similarities and there's also distinct experiences that the TCK doesn't have that the immigrant kid does, and that the immigrant kid doesn't have that the TCK does. So I think the similarities are really strong and really important, but the distinctions also matter because TCKs have experiences that immigrant kids don't, and immigrant kids have experiences that TCKs don't.
For example.
Yes.
I'm like, what are those differences then? You can tell us a story if there's anything that could make it more, for us to be more clear. The other thing
that I think is important to bring up here is intersectionality, because you can be both.
Mm-hmm.
You can be both an immigrant kid and a TCK. And if we lump everything in the same category, we forget or we miss or we don't see the intersectionality. So I have talked to so many kids who are both immigrant kids and TCKs, and they have a different layer of experience than a kid who is just a TCK or a kid who is just an immigrant kid. So if you talk about kids who, like the kid I talked about before, Korean immigrant family moved to Canada, other Korean immigrant families who moved to the US, Chinese immigrant families moved to the UK or Australia or South Africa. I've talked to lots of different kids in these situations. Family immigrates, and then one sibling takes their kids off to an expat posting, one doesn't. So you have two cousins who have very different experiences. One of these cousins grows up as an immigrant kid in one country. One grows up as a TCK, but is also an immigrant kid. Often, those TCK immigrant kids have a stronger connection to their heritage, culture, and language than the immigrant kid who stayed in the target country. Because in an international setting, they have a broader language arena. Their parents are more likely to have been in communities that included, people from their heritage, country, and culture. There was less pressure to have to conform as a model minority to the target country. So you have kids who tended to have a more balanced, less pressure to balance just those two, because they're being experienced multiple cultures, and there wasn't a sense that it was bad to balance cultures. So it's a completely different experience than the kids who were only immigrant kids, if they were both immigrant kids and TCKs. But at the same time, a kid who was an immigrant kid and a TCK, as opposed to just a TCK, we're also dealing with those, heritage issues and trying to please their parents' expectations, and straddle these, 3 different cultures or whatever in a way that their, single country TCK friend wasn't. Like there's complexities and layers of identity going on there when you start getting the intersection of different cross-cultural identities. I know lots of kids who would have 3 or 4 different intersectionalities within their cross-cultural identity. They're bicultural, they're biracial, they're TCKs, and they're also immigrant kids, things like that. Or they're international adoptees and they're TCKs and they're biracial, or whatever it is, right? Like you get layers upon layers, and each of those layers has its own unique experiences. So I think it's important to recognize the differences so that we can see the intersections and not ignore those experiences. Same as intersectionality is important when we talk about race and gender. I think it's important when we talk about cross-cultural experiences.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was just like thinking around like the people that I don't know, and I was thinking what you're saying could be very beneficial for some of them. So I'm definitely gonna share the episode to them. And especially like you talk about international adoptees, that's also a very minor population that people don't usually see. And I used to teach one, and she was adopted from China but being raised somewhere here, and she's coming back to me saying that she wants to learn her heritage language. But I'm like, where's her heritage? She's like, she wants to go back to China. And so I think that is something I can tell, like they're sort of searching their roots and to find out what their family histories are. And I was just thinking like, wow, how challenging, or how, I don't know how the emotions are. It could be very positive, but also in the teenage years, because we talk about formative years and in different cultures, I thought about those people, those kids when they're growing up and they cannot see a role model of their own. And I guess that's one of their challenges. So then that's a very good segue. What are the advantages of TCKs and what about the challenges? You can share some stories if you have any.
Oh man, this is the stuff I talk about all the time, right? Like, I actually want to just backtrack just quickly. Like on the adoptive TCKs, it's another intersection that's really interesting. International adoptees are way more visible in the TCK population because you get people who adopt from the countries they're living in.
That's right.
Or who choose to move internationally because they'd already adopted and they go and live in the country they'd adopted from.
Yeah.
And so there's a different experience when you're living as a foreigner in the country that you were born in with a foreign passport because you're adopted.
Yeah.
Which is another intersection that's really interesting.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a whole other topic that we could talk about for an hour. So
definitely. Yeah, definitely.
I just wanted to throw that in there to complicate things.
There's a big community of adoptees here in Colorado.
And there's a lot of different like attitudes and opinions and experiences within that community.
Yeah.
Because there are people who are extremely defensive of either their birth parents or their adoptive parents or both, and others who had really difficult and even abusive situations in their adoptive families. And we need to listen to all of those stories because they're all valid. And there is definite trauma in being separated from your heritage because it doesn't matter how well loved you are, you look different. You feel that difference. People perceive you on the outside, and so there is that disconnect that you feel. And so, I think we have to be open to and honest about the difficulties that go with that situation.
Agreed. Just an example to share with the audience. I guess we can kind of maximize that my experience to those adoptees or kind of have the empathetic heart and feelings for them. For example, I came here when I was 31 to the US.
and I had a hard time finding the right makeup products because it's
Yes.
not my skin tone. And what they're doing is like, I don't know, the color's wrong. And I don't even put on that much makeup. But for me, it's like I stand there and it's like, all these are not the similar products I've seen in Taiwan. Okay, maybe next time when I go to Taiwan, then I should bring more products. So and being a teenager, I feel I've saw the video somewhere saying that, you know, when they're growing up, especially girls, they want to put on makeup because everyone in high school they do, and then they find it difficult to communicate with their white parents because they have little eyes and all that. So
and same for, you know, black men with hair cutting is very different, or what skin products or hair products you need are different from different races. And it's one thing when you can't find what you need because you're in a different country, but if your parents don't know what to teach you, that's completely different again. So so talking about challenges for TCKs, when your parents don't know what to teach you, I mean, that's the crux of a lot of this, right? A lot of what I do is all about teaching parents who want to do the best for their kids what they're missing. The title of my book was Misunderstood because that was what I heard over and over and over in my interviews. One of the biggest problems that TCKs face is that their experience is fundamentally different to their parents because it's formative for them. As children, they're experiencing more than one cultural construct. And so they have a different perspective and a different worldview because for them, there's more than one way that the world works because both systems or all three systems are natural to them. Kind of like if you grow up bilingual or trilingual, all of the languages are natural to you. Neither one is right or wrong. They both work, even though they have completely different systems. It's the same when you're bicultural in that way, that each way of thinking is normal and right. But every culture has different values, different ways of getting things done at different systems. And an action that's right in one is wrong in the other. And so it's very easy to get in trouble. You have to change the way you do things. And parents who live in one culture until they're adults and then move overseas do not have the same experience because they have one core understanding of the world and then they learn others through that one lens, whereas TCKs are seeing the world through these different lenses. Their attachments are different. You know, if you as a family go and you live somewhere for 3 years, if you've taken a 6-year-old, an 8-year-old, a 10-year-old, they're spending, you know, half to a third of their life there. 3 years is a blip for a parent, but it's not for a child. That is a very significant part of their life. Those 3 years, it's not just a couple of years. It's a huge chunk of who they are at that point. And a lot of parents don't understand how deeply important the experiences in that time are. So what ends up happening is you get kids who learn to perform or to act because they're being different in every situation, including sometimes to their parents or to their grandparents. I've got to act this way because it's the only way to be accepted in this situation. So what they have to learn is to integrate all of that because it can be really good to learn to present to people what they need. That adaptability can be really strong in life and in work situations. You get people who can be really great team leaders actually because they can problem solve really effectively. They can see that there's more than one way to fix a problem. They can see that there's, you know, not malice maybe behind the difference in a team member, but only if you've learned to integrate all of that and be like, I'm one person underneath all of this. So I really focus a lot on values. What are your core values? That I'm acting different ways in different situations because I'm acting from the same value in each situation, right? I treat this person this way and I treat that person that way because I'm choosing respect in each situation, and respect looks different. But before you get to that point, you get kids who, you know, they go from a school where asking questions is part of the curriculum, that like teachers will mark down how many times you ask questions in class. And then they move to a classroom or a school where asking questions is seen as disrespecting the teacher's authority. And they go from being an A+ student to their first week in a new school, they're at the principal's office for being disrespectful and rude. And they don't know what's happened because they're the same student who's acting the same way, right? Like that kind of confusion happens a lot. So that's a really constant challenge for TCKs, is navigating a world that's changing around them and trying to, who am I in the middle of all of this change and inconstancy? And yeah, it can be really rough.
Yes.
Especially
and
parents don't see.
I know. And so I interviewed Eber. It's around, I think, episode 4 or 5. I'll put the notes in the episode notes. So he said that being in TCK makes him very flexible in many situations, but then he doesn't feel belong in most of the places.
Yeah.
And probably he only feels I don't know, but probably a lot of kids will feel they belong only in their family or only in a certain play group.
And with other TCKs is another thing I hear a lot, that the third culture isn't a geographical place, but it's our hometown anyway.
Yeah.
It's something I hear a lot. Like, only other people who've been through what I've been through understand. Another reason I think the CCK umbrella is really important. Like, you may not have the exact same experience, but you can have emotional resonance of being othered or being in between, or, you know, navigating multiple cultures. So yeah, that feeling of not belonging is super common. The other challenge that's really, really common is what we call unresolved grief. So in my current research, I've had about 650 adults so far do my current survey, and 90% have had issues with unresolved grief. So that means where you've had a loss or a grief, maybe sometimes something very small, but you haven't felt those feelings and processed it, you've pushed it down and suppressed it. That is really common with TCKs, because what tends to happen is that they go through way more transition and change, way more losses, and it's too much for a child to process on their own. So they have coping strategies like suppressing that grief, ignoring that grief, pretending I don't feel that, it's not important, it doesn't matter, this is normal, it happens to everyone. You can get a separation of thinking and feeling, so they might be intellectually ahead of the curve, but emotionally a bit stunted. That can be quite common. And it's not because they're not emotional or not caring people. They're often extremely empathetic because they do have this sense of, you know, seeing another way of life and seeing that it's all normal. Like they see the other side of the argument, so to speak. But you know, they've just been through too much. And so it can be as simple as my friend moved away and that was sad. But when that happens every year for 5 or 6 or 7 years, you just get tired of saying goodbye over and over again. You get tired of making friends and they leave, or you leave. You get tired of, I go and see my grandparents for a couple months in summer and I have to say goodbye. Every year I have to do the same thing over and over again. And you just stop letting yourself care. It's a totally natural coping mechanism. Adults do it too. It's not healthy for any of us, kids or adults. So learning this grief processing is extremely important. It's a lot of what I do is teaching parents to feel and express their own grief so that they can do it and model it for their kids. Because adults in expat circles often start suppressing their grief as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not easy.
I know. So like in episode 41, I interviewed Ken. Ken lived in 5 different countries, but he and his parents are Japanese. So yeah, he has exactly the same thing that you're saying. They have to say goodbye. And so when I asked him, do you feel sad, or did you ever complain to your parents that you have to say goodbye to your best friends? He's like, nope. And I'm like, why is that? Is it part of your family culture? He's like, yeah, it's just, we don't talk back to our parents. And I'm like, okay, wow, that's a lot of stress. So in your research, you did 750 people.
Yeah, about 750.
Wow, that's a book. Yeah, that's a big research project. And so I'm curious, because you chose adult TCKs, and why is that?
I think partly because you need to have a little bit of space to look back and to recognize, okay, so what did this look like? None of us can be completely objective. Also partly because you're asking people to think about fairly emotional experiences, and you don't want to do that with a child in a survey experience. That's just not ethical, I don't think. So I did surveys with people under the age of 18, but I mean, I did interviews, like in-person interviews, where I could actually have contact and connection with them, or I had some external connection where I knew who to connect them with if they were struggling with under 18s. But like, I don't think I had any interviews with under 18s where I didn't have parental permission or like connection. But yeah, for the survey, I kept it over 18, just because that we're talking about stuff that can be quite emotional. You know, these are real trigger points for a lot of TCKs. They don't think about this for a reason. They don't question it for a reason because it's painful. It's painful to think about what these experiences meant. A lot of people, their survival tactic, their coping strategy is, my childhood was great. Don't tell me anything else. Right? Like, let's separate the good and the bad, right? Either it's all bad or it's all good, you know? Learning to hold the good and the bad together in tension is a part of emotional maturity, but it's hard work. It's kind of why I love the movie Inside Out. I mean, like, the fact that the goal was to be able to hold the joy and sadness together, that like a memory has mixed emotions and that's okay. That it's actually important that grief has a place and a purpose and we need that. I think that's a beautiful message and really important. I've actually used it in some TCK retreats and stuff as a tool to talk about this, because we need to be able to have those mixed emotions. We can be both excited about new opportunities and upset about a move that we're making. It can be both at once. Often it is. And when I'm talking with parents a lot of the time, the piece that we need as parents or support people, or as, you know, as a friend of the family, in my case, often what kids need often is not to be fixed. You can't fix the problem. They just need to know that someone hears them and that it's okay to feel that way. I mean, that's it. It's that simple. We just need to have freedom to express those feelings and feel those feelings, and for that to be okay. It's not rocket science. We just need to express the feelings. It's just hard as adults to see kids be sad. We often tell them, don't be sad, don't cry, don't worry, you'll make new friends. We do all these things that shut down that grieving process and tell them to not share their feelings with us.
I think you already touched upon some of the feelings and awareness for adult TCKs. I am just curious, before we get into the parental support and community support for TCKs, CCKs, what would you say to adult TCKs?
You make complete sense in your context. You might not know a lot of people who grew up the way that you grew up, but they're out there and they've been through what you've been through. And it's worth the work. It's worth doing the emotional work to be free to choose your life and live your life your own way. There's no right or wrong choices. It's not right or wrong to choose to live a settled life or to choose to move around. Either choice is totally fine as long as you're not living out of fear or running away from something, as long as it's a positive choice for your own reasons. And that's why we do the work. We do the work so that we're not living out of fear, so that we're not controlled by emotions that we haven't processed, so that we can connect with people. I was talking to someone just a couple of days ago who is realizing they need to do their work so that they can connect emotionally with their own kids. Doing the work is worth it. And sometimes that means you have to try a few times to find a therapist who understands. I've talked to people who've done 4, 5, even 10 different therapists to find someone who gets that their childhood affect them. Often what we get is what we call complex PTSD. So you're getting symptoms of PTSD, but it's not from a big traumatic event. It's just from lots of little things, lots of little moves, lots of little goodbyes that have added up and added up and added up over the years until you've got triggers around saying goodbye, around packing or around suitcases or around whatever it is that was difficult and painful for you. And so finding someone who is empathetic and sympathetic to that and who recognizes the impact of that is really helpful, really important. And there's lots of resources these days to find people who get that.
I will definitely put the website that Tanya has. In the episode notes, there are a lot blog blog articles, and she has been, writing for different medias, and there's just a lot of resource on her website. So I'll definitely put it there for the listeners' resource. Last question. How can parents and the community support TCKs?
The first part is just to understand, to learn what a child's perspective is like and how that differs from the adults. So read some of the literature. There's a lot of good literature out there now. So my book and the original Third Culture Kids, Growing Up Among Worlds, are the two books that really look at a broad perspective. Mine's much more on the social, emotional, hearing kids' stories. The other book is much more comprehensive. It's a bit more academic, a heavier read. There's also lots of stories from kids' perspectives. Marilyn Gardner writes beautifully about, what it's like as a young person, and even, as an adult looking back, how that impacts you. There's lots of stuff now. There's resources specifically about how to practically do this. So go and read, learn. Again, I have resources on my website. I can give more resources to ping, to link. But I feel like these days, especially, you can find the resources. A lot of people go overseas and the company or the government or the school, whoever sends them, doesn't give them resources. But we have the internet. You can search. There's great resources available now. And a lot of it's inexpensive. And so you can find what you need to support your family. You, as a parent, make the choice to move your family. Your kids don't make the choice to become a TCK. No kid ever chooses to become a TCK. That choice is made for them. So I think as parents, you have a responsibility to learn what you can to make it easier for them. And for other community members, we know that having other adults in their lives who care, who notice, who give space for them to express those feelings is really helpful long term. And so being someone who notices kids, who talks to them, who cares what they have to say makes a huge difference long term. So even if you're not a parent, learning and reading and getting to know kids in your environment is really, really helpful, especially if you live overseas, especially if you know, overseas expat immigrant kids in your area. Get to know them. It'll be incredibly helpful for them.
When you're talking about this is really helpful. I think a lot of kids just wants to be heard. I work with kids and even adults. They just want to talk about their experience. They talk about what's happening instead of being lectured in a way. It's like, you shouldn't be feeling like this. You should be doing this. And just do this and all that. But I don't think a lot of them need that lecture or solution, but just to walk through with their journey and maybe just be in the rain with an umbrella.
I love that. That's a beautiful picture. I mean, I do a lot of work with international schools, and often I'll do sessions with students, and I do sessions on grief and on resilience when we talk about outlawed grief. So someone telling you don't cry or don't worry, you'll make new friends, all those kind of stuff. Every kid has got experiences like this. And when I ask them, what do you wish that person had said instead of that? What do you wish they'd done instead? There's usually a bit of quiet while they think about it. And every single time they come back and say, I wish that they had just listened to me and told me it was okay to feel this way. Even middle school boys will come back with this really just gentle, calm, real answer. I can have a completely rowdy session and then these 7th or 8th grade boys will come and have a real moment of calm at that point because they all know what they need. Every age group, they know what they need. They want to be taken seriously and they know that their parents can't fix it. When parents pretend they can fix it, kids actually feel more alienated. Because they know my friends moved away. There's nothing mum and dad can do to fix that. That's happened. And so just being allowed to be sad about that is the most powerful thing in the world. A parent just saying, that is really hard. My friend moved away too and I'm really sad about it. That. And I get it wrong too. You know, a couple of years ago, one of my really close friends was leaving very suddenly, and I'd gone around to help pack. I was in a study by myself packing some stuff, and her 9-year-old walked in and just kind of, well, she didn't walk in, she stomped in and starts complaining about this and this and that, and this isn't fair, and my friend's on holiday, so I don't get to say goodbye to them, and we have to say goodbye to the dog, which wasn't their dog. It was just like a friend's dog or a neighborhood dog that, you know, obviously couldn't come with them because it wasn't their dog, but she was just mad about all the things. And I heard myself say the words that I tell people not to say. I said, don't worry, you'll make new friends. I'm like, oh my gosh, you know better than that. What are you doing? But it's so easy for those words to come out of our mouths because it is so hard to see a child who's upset, and we want to make it better. And we know it's true. We know that they will make new friends. We know it will be okay. But in that moment, that is just not what that kid needs to hear. And so I stopped and I said, I'm sorry. You're right. This is unfair. Do you want to tell me about it? And she stopped and looked at me, and then she walked over and she plopped herself down in my lap and she ranted for a good 5 minutes about all of the things, because anger is a form of grief. And when she sort of wound down, I said, you know, it makes a lot of sense that you feel sad and angry. I would feel that way too. And I actually am sad that you're leaving and that I won't get to see you all the time. You won't always feel this way. One day it'll feel a bit better. But right now, it makes a lot of sense that you feel angry and you feel sad. She's like, okay. And off she wandered. Like, she didn't need me to fix it. She just needed to feel her feelings.
Yeah. Like, someone agrees with her. And actually, I think
that's what we need to do. We just need to get those feelings out.
I know.
If I had stopped her expressing that, those feelings would have stayed inside and she would have felt them all day.
Or
the next time she tried to say it, someone shut it down, that would have gone into.
Yeah.
And that's a 9-year-old. And if that happens several times a day or several times a year, every year for the next 10 years, it builds up and it builds up and builds up. And the further you get away from what made you feel the feeling and the feeling itself, the harder it is to know what you're feeling that feeling about. This leads to much higher rates of depression and anxiety and unresolved grief because we're not even sure what we're feeling feelings about anymore, because we're so far removed from what triggered that feeling. So, yeah, having space for kids to healthily express those emotions is crucial for their long-term good. And that was me as not a parent, just a friend, being able to be a place that she could express those feelings.
Yeah. Wow. That makes me think about Inside Out you just mentioned. There's the little scene, right? Like after the football or whatever ball Riley was playing and she lost. She was so sad that her parents came over and just to be with her. And that turned into a happy memory. So, wow. Yeah.
And the key moment of the movie, all of the things are going wrong. When she stops feeling feelings is when she gets basically depressed. And when she goes to her parents and she expresses the hurt and her parents validate those feelings of hurt, I miss Minnesota too, I'm sad too, that moment of just being able to cry and be held and be safe, that is what makes everything okay. It's a beautiful movie for expressing the importance of this, not just for TCKs, for everybody. This is something we all need to learn. It's a human thing. It's just for TCKs, the stakes tend to be higher because they go through so much of this grief. It builds up faster. It needs to be processed faster, and it's kids need to be taught these tools. Need to have it modeled for them because they're not going to learn it on their own easily.
Awesome. Wow, I learned so much. Cool. Thank you so much. Before we end, is there any last thought that you would like to share?
I mean, we've covered a lot. I guess the only other thing I want to say is I really believe that cross-cultural experiences in childhood are a net gain, are a positive. In the research I did for my first book, the statistics have surprised even me, that the vast majority of people who grew up as TCKs were positive overall about their experiences. They were happy and thankful and glad to have grown up that way. 92% said they wouldn't take it back if they could. These are people who at the same time were saying that they had been lonely or felt isolated or had struggled. Both things at once, right? We're integrating those experiences both at once. Not all of them are going to want to raise their kids the same way, but still appreciate the experiences they had. A lot of the work I do is in preventative care because I think that a lot of the negative outcomes that we see, they don't have to be that way. This isn't inevitable. Just because you grow up in a cross-cultural setting does not mean you have to experience unresolved grief or depression or anxiety or identity struggles. We just need to set up better preventative care, create better tools and deliver better tools to families and children. And that's a lot of the work I do. The other half of what I do is working with young adults to help them work through this when they didn't receive those tools as kids. And that's where my current research is aimed, is working with adults to create kind of a toolkit for them who want to process this in their adult years.
So the listeners can find you online by TanyaCrossman.com and also on Twitter, Tanya TCK, or Instagram, Misunderstood TCK, or Facebook, Misunderstood TCK. Are you offering any services as well?
I'm in the process of setting up some virtual workshops because, I used to work mostly in international schools in person, but COVID has changed everything. So
I know.
I'm doing some stuff through tcktraining.com. I've been working with them a little bit. So I actually have a repatriation workshop coming up in a couple of weeks. And I'll have some more workshops coming up with them after the summer. So that's a place you can find me. And when I'm doing my own stuff, it'll be on TanyaCrossman.com.
Cool. Awesome. So you're also open to, if people want to book you for a lecture, for a speech, that kind of thing.
I do a lot of online seminars.
Great. So if you're in that community, you want to support more of TCKs, CCKs, feel free to shoot an email or contact Tanya on her website, and I'll put everything in the episode notes. Thank you so much for your time, Tanya.
You're welcome.
Thanks for listening to Try with Ping. If you think someone will benefit from this episode, don't forget to share with them. You can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram. If you like my show, you can buy me a chai with small gifts. Details are in the episode notes. Till next time!